Well, thank you very much to Brian and everyone at On1 Software for having me on. It's quite a thrill for me personally to be here and to sort of share how I developed my photography and how it all sort of came about. Uh, the main topic of this webinar, I guess, is going to be focused primarily on my experience with the On1 software suite without any Photoshop experience. As you can probably tell, like my screen is sharing an Aperture window right now. I do all of my post-processing and editing out of Aperture, and that's a selection of different plugins. And I just don't use Photoshop, and I'll touch on a little bit about why. There's no real vendetta against it or anything like that. It's just a choice that I subconsciously made, and sort of, I guess, it organically became unnecessary. I guess in my workflow is a purely personal choice that I sort of subconsciously made. I do like to keep things very informal when I do things like this. I find that it's a lot better for me and as well as everyone who's listening in. So with that in mind, I would like to make this kind of fun and interactive with anyone who's listening and watching today. So if you guys do have any questions or anything like that as I go through the different images that I show, I'm just going to flip through a couple of images in my workflow now, in my portfolio now. Yeah, any questions that come up, I'd be happy to answer them as I go. Or if you have any ideas or anything like that as I'm editing, I'd love to sort of try and make this collaborative. Like if you have an idea, like, oh, why don't you do this or something like that, that I think will lend well to the whole how to edit in On1 software with just different ideas and turning ideas into vision in photography. So yeah, so I guess I'm just going to start talking about a little bit about Photoshop and its place in photography as I saw it. For me, it was always, when I got into photography, I'd known about Adobe and Lightroom just from reading about photography, right? It's in most of the different books that you sort of read, and a lot of them are focused that way. But when I was getting into it, I like to be one of those people who tries to get as much information on a topic as possible and come at it with an unbiased perspective or a full plate of knowledge, if you will. And so all these different products had different, free 30-day trials and such. So I downloaded Aperture, I downloaded Lightroom to try and get the different experiences in each of the product tools. And I ended up going with Aperture purely on personal preference. Like all of these images were created in Aperture and just some simple plugins and extensions of Aperture. There's no Photoshop or anything like that involved here. A lot of the tools that are in Aperture are also available in Lightroom and some in Photoshop. But it was purely a choice made on that I was becoming more productive quicker inside of Aperture instead of inside of Photoshop. I found and this is nothing against Photoshop or anything like that, I found the UI to be personally unintuitive. I couldn't figure out what I wanted to do, whereas in Aperture things are just here. There's this adjustments menu and I can go and do it that way. Now, unfortunately, that does limit me in what I can do. Like Photoshop has leaps and bounds more tools available inside it. Things like layering and masking and compositing you just can't do inside of Aperture natively. So all of that aspect of photography and style of shooting I was automatically distancing myself from, which I recognized as a problem when I was starting to learn. But it was kind of one of those things, like it's information overload. Where do you start if you just presented with a bevy of information? And it's kind of like an overload. You don't know where to start and you get overwhelmed and you start to fumble. So as I was teaching myself photography, I just began with the basics and simple editing, like adjusting things here. You can see exposure, enhancements, and different things like that. Aperture had all of these. And as I said, it was just more intuitive to me inside of Aperture to make those adjustments. Now, when I came down the line and I was getting more and more involved in photography and my, I guess, vision was expanding and the photos that I wanted to make I couldn't make with inside of Aperture. That coincided nicely with On1 releasing Perfect Layers, which back in the 5.x version of their suite was, I think, sort of revolutionary for them, and it introduced and made available to me the ability to add different layers of images. Like this image on the screen here was actually made up of two different images, and I couldn't have made this. Like if you can see the blur in the sky here, this I created in Perfect Layers back in the 5.5 days, where I would layer and mask in different parts of this image. And that was a very steep learning curve for me because I had no idea, I had no experience with what a layer was, what a mask was, and how it all went together. So I want to get started with that because layering and masking are two very, very, I guess, core concepts to the new version of ON1 Perfect Photo Suite. And I'm going to bring up the first image I'm going to edit here, which is this image I shot recently. I was actually with Brian at Multnomah Falls in Oregon, just outside of Portland. And I ended up taking a few exposures with my 10-stop filter on. I picked these two because I wanted a good sky, and I wanted a well-exposed sky, I should say, and I wanted a well-exposed-ish. It's too dark down here, but a well-exposed, I guess, detail in the rocks and in the bridge and for the waterfall here. So I'll open these inside Photo Suite, and I'll talk a little bit about how layers and masks work. Now this is, I guess, beginner information for Photo Suite, but I think it's crucial to talk about it because it really does give a good perspective about how I came to learn this without any knowledge of Photoshop. I don't know of any other tools out there that have layering and masking, and that may just be through my short tenure in the field or something or other. But when you load up the Perfect Photo Suite, you have these a list of layers here, right? And I couldn't figure out exactly how they worked when I put them together. I'm just like toggling them on and off right now. And there are different ways you can interact with a layer through masking. Okay, and it took me a while to sort of wrap my head around the concept of how they work together. But sort of as you're looking at them here, right, they're kind of like two pieces of paper in this little rectangle that's vertical. And you're sort of staring straight at them as if they were placed literally on top of each other, standing up off of a desk or something like that. And the way that they work, it's sort of visualized a bit differently here in the Layers tab versus what you actually see as the final image here in the main part of the screen. If you imagine these as like two sheets of paper or something, something like that, like or stacks of pancakes or something, placed one over the other, like completely aligned, placed one over the other, you're going to get like the different layers, essentially. And if you imagine those sort of as a cross-section view, you've got from top to bottom, this is the piece of paper that's on the top, and this is the piece of paper that's on the bottom. And that's sort of how the layers work. With one layer on top of the other, you can't see what's underneath. So when you toggle this eyeball here and turn it on, it's like you're putting the second piece of paper on top of the piece of paper that's at the bottom. And so this is just the original image that I imported as one of them here. And this is the other one. So when I turn them on, all I can see is what's in this image. And this is sort of where masking comes into play and lets you bring out different elements of the layers that are underneath this piece of paper. Are there any questions right at this point? I feel like that's a good place to pause after talking about layers.
No, we're good right now, Jacob. Andrew just asked he was asking what the toolbar in the upper right of the screen is, and I was just answering him, but I assume he's talking about the module selector and not your iStat menus.
Are you okay?
Yeah.
These are the different plugins inside of ON1, and I'll move in and out of those as we go in through the suite. These are like the different plugins that they've bundled in the suite together. Layers is sort of the home base and mask, portrait, effects, blur, all the rest of the plugins. Okay.
Actually, also, Jacob, Brooke brought up a good question. If you could, I don't know if you're going to be doing another image or when you're done, if you can go a little bit of a slower clip of how you brought the images from Aperture to the suite.
Sure, absolutely. In fact, I can do that again right now since that's a good place to sort of do this.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Um, so you can bring any amount of images into Perfect Photo Suite if you want. I just knew that I wanted to work with these particular two out of n different images that I had here. There are a couple of ways to do it. You can right-click on the image, any of the images you've selected, go to Edit with Plugin, and then Perfect Photo Suite is an option in that menu, and you just click it, and Photo Suite will open. The other way you can do it, instead of using the right-click, is to go up to the Photos menu, and it's the exact same procedure, Edit with Plugin and Perfect Photo Suite. That's all that there is. There's no configuring this as an external editor, which you can do if you want to use Photoshop with Aperture or any other image editing program. It's just all, it's basically the same way you'd work with any other plugins that you have listed here. You click on Perfect Photo Suite, it does its thing, and they come up. Good question.
Processing, I can just also say this is a very similar methodology to Lightroom. There was a question that just came up, and you'd have the exact same process. You'd select multiple images or one image, and obviously it's a different menu item. You'd go to File and then plug in extras, but it mirrors Aperture very closely. So
yeah, that's right. Okay, so onto the subject of masking and what essentially a mask is. So we know that layers are sort of like the two pieces of paper on top of one another. And potentially, like, the reason I took these two different images was because I knew that with such long exposure for the waterfall, in this case, I would get a completely blown out sky. Okay, I took a different image exposed for the sky when I was shooting, and I knew that when I came and imported this, that the background and everything else around the sky would be dark or underexposed. So in this, I want to bring the correctly exposed sky in and around the trees into this image, and we do that through a mask. Now you can liken the mask in the whole like pieces of paper analogy to going at this with a pair of scissors and essentially cutting out a piece of the paper. Okay, and we do that with this masking toolbar here on the right. You can interact with the mask with these three different options here. Paint out and paint in are essentially the ways that you cut out of the piece of paper. And you can brush it in with this brush tool, and I don't know if there are any other ways that you can directly sort of cut out the mask. There's another mask tool here, which is a whole different beast on its own. I'm not going to get into that in this particular webinar. I know that Brian's touched on them in others, and he can probably provide links to this tool in the chat module somewhere. But the ways that you can control this brush, and this is what I'll focus on mostly, you can control the size of the brush here with the slider, the feathering of it, which is essentially like how harsh the edge of the brush is, and the opacity, which is how strong you want to apply the mask. If you apply it at 100% and drag across here like this, you'll see the underneath image come through at 100% strength. Whereas if I just undo that and apply it at 50%, you'll see it come through at a softer degree, if you will. I use a Wacom tablet when I am editing, and I select this option here for the Wacom to control the brush size. Now what that lets me do is, say I want this brush size in general for this area, right? As I'm sort of working, I can control how light I'm pressing on the tablet, and it will make the brush size smaller. Or if I press harder, it will make the brush bigger. And that's really useful for when you're coming in like around tree lines and things, and I want to just get really, really light in on these edges and bring in the piece of the sky that I want. And I'll do this better as I go through it, but I do want to sort of talk a bit about what this is actually doing. So if I reset this, reset will clear off all the brushing that you've done. Now I'll do it at 100 just to prove a point here. This is very sloppy, but if I just drag this in, right, what the masking tool will do is essentially this is the act of cutting out from the piece of paper that is the top layer. Okay. So I'm just dragging and sort of painting over this section of the image. You can see when I release my mouse, you've sort of got this black area on what is called the mask. This white and black rectangle is your mask. As you paint in at different strengths, you'll see different shades of black occur, or gray. Okay, and you can take that down further like this. And they just get softer and softer and fainter and fainter. This is essentially like you're cutting off a piece of the paper at full strength in this black section up here. At full strength meaning you're cutting it all off. If you were shaving part of it off to leave some behind, that would be this grayer section here. And then if you were to look at it from a top-down perspective, if you paint everything in at 100% opacity, you've essentially got a top-down view of the top two-thirds of the first layer, leaving way to see whatever is underneath. And if you have other layers, like you can put in fill layers of colors, and again, I'm just going to do this for the purpose of displaying what a mask is. I can paint out parts of this green layer here to let through what's underneath here. I'm still with my opacity all the way down. So this will let through the sky, and let's just say I want this middle section to be more green than anything else. Right? This is the white part of this image is revealing exactly what is on this mask. Anything black or a shade of black is concealing it. It's allowing what's underneath this layer to come through, which is all of the the black part of this image, which is going to be the underneath layer here, and then the gray and the white will display. So that's sort of masking. Are there any questions on that before I move on to actually editing an image?
No, we're good, Jacob.
Cool. All right, so I won't save out of there. And I'm going to move on to an image that I took, actually, again, shooting with Brian. He inspired me to edit a shot that I took of a sunrise here in Seattle. I was actually out with Brian and our friend Nicole, who is going to be giving a webinar in a couple of weeks here. This is a shot of the dock on the West Seattle shore, looking at the city skyline and the sunrise. And I took 3 shots here because I wanted a shot where I plan on manually blending different parts of the images using layers and masks to do so. All of this is possible now for me because of this layers software, essentially, and the ability to mask with ON1. If I don't have Photoshop, so I couldn't have done it without.
Hey,
this
Jacob.
software tool. Yeah.
While you're talking about this, can you talk about your bracket methodology? Like, people are asking, did you bracket? If so, how did you bracket?
Sure, good question. I wasn't actually bracketing in this case. It's interesting the way that I do this. A lot of it involves a bunch of guesswork and some mathematics to figure out exactly what I want to do. If you can see up here on the right, so if you watch this section, this will show you the camera settings that I had at this point. ISO 400, f7.1, and just over a 2-minute exposure. So I'll figure out exactly what light is giving me a good exposure at this point. While I'm shooting this, I'm watching the histogram on the back of my camera. So this is essentially a decent exposure. There's some red clipped and some black clipped or whatever, but there's nothing that's sort of blown out to make it look really, really crazy like that, for example. This is all just way overexposed. So I know that at this point, roughly, I've got my medium exposure. So then if I were to expose for the sky, I can, at around the same, I don't know how clearly you guys can see this, but this is going from f7.1 to f8, which is a third of a stop of aperture, and half the time, same ISO. So this is the shot that I took, intentionally exposing for the brighter part of the image, which is the sky. I had planned when I was taking this to mask in a couple of different things. I wanted the sky, I wanted a good exposed dock, and maybe some of the water underneath the dock here. Okay, so this image was exposing for the sky. This isn't using auto exposure bracketing or anything like that. It's purely starting off at a point. You got to start somewhere, right? I think I must have started here and I changed lenses. So I just picked a 2-minute time roughly, and I used my iPhone to time the shot. I set it to 2 minutes, and after 2 minutes I closed the shutter. It looked good. It just happened to look good at that point. This was the shot before that. I guess I learned from 30 seconds was way too dark, so I put it up to 2 minutes. I could have put it to 5 minutes and found out it was too bright and halved it and doubled it and just sort of whittled my way down to what I thought was a good exposure based on the histogram. It's really important when you're out shooting that you are looking at this histogram, because this will tell you exactly if you've got a correct exposure. And once I've figured out the settings for the correct exposure, which is around this time frame at this aperture and ISO, I work from there. I take it down a stop to get a good exposed sky. I think I might have even gone. That's the same. Oh, it's even half again. Okay, so I went from, I don't know if you guys can see this clearly. This is 136 seconds is my good exposure, down to 62, and then 30 for an even darker sky. And then back up to 126 seconds to get more of the dock. Now, the challenge here is that the light is constantly changing very quickly because the sun is coming up. So I had to be as quick as I could be with whatever. So you might have to adjust the settings there. But for the purposes of editing this image, I do want to work with just looking at the sky to figure out exactly which sky I like the best. And I think I like this one in particular, just because it's got more motion visible in the sky than this one does. So this will be my sky image, and I'll just mark this with a marker in Aperture. You've got these markers here. This is purely because I don't want to go, oh, this was the sky that I wanted. I know this one was the sky that I picked. And this is obviously the best exposure for the dock and possibly some of the water. So I just mark these out of habit so that I know later, I know later which images I've used. So again, I'll right-click and bring these into PhotoSuite, go to Edit with Plugin, Perfect PhotoSuite. Are any questions while this is loading?
Having a discussion between different bracket methodologies.
Okay.
Whereas you use the aperture to bracket instead of using shutter speed. So I'm just explaining the differences.
I was using I was using the shutter speed.
Oh, you were using
the shutter was what was changing. I went from pretty much f7. Actually, in this series, it was all f8. From 62 seconds to 30 seconds.
But were you just adjusting shutter speed? You weren't using the D700's bracket to do it, right?
No, I was adjusting the shutter manually.
Yeah. Okay. There. Cool.
Okay. So where does we go? All right. So at this point, I've got my two images that I want to blend together. So that I don't forget, you can label these just by double-clicking. And I'll say dock, because this is what I want to use for the dock. And my Wacom doesn't like to double-click. I'll say sky for the sky. And you can reorder these if you want. I'll usually work with, I like to paint out for whatever reason. I don't know why. It just seems to make more sense to me this way. Because I can visualize it better from a top-looking down perspective. I can take individual parts away, and I'm left with sort of a cut of what is available. So at this point, I'll start with the opacity somewhere here and a brush size about here. And I'll start to just paint in parts of the dock with the brush. And it'll go something like this. And I'll try and do this as good as I can to get this right. And this is what you want to put, I think, most of your effort into, because as you'll see a little later as I get into this, the mask will actually carry through as you apply different edits. Um, there is a better way to see what you've masked in by going to Show Mask down here in the masking section and clicking on Overlay. This will show you exactly what you've masked in at what strength. If you brush over this again, you'll see it's a different color of red. That means that the way that ON1 does their masking is it's an iteratively strengthed mask. So if I brush over that again, it will get even redder up until the point where it's at 100%. So I'll just reset this for now, and I want to make sure that I'm getting essentially all of the dock and some of the railing here, because I want that to come out. I don't want to touch the water too much because I like the color that's there. If I do accidentally say do that, what I can do is just go back to paint in, which is the opposite of paint out, as you'd expect, and just take it off. You can drag this all the way up to 100 and go remove like that. So this is just getting me to a point where I can see, oops, I'm still on paint in. I'll do this a little quicker than what I probably otherwise would because I'm wary of time. Okay, so this is the railing that I've got here, bringing it in. You can see I've gone way over the edges and things like that here, so I'll go to paint in and draw this. I'll bring the brush size down a bunch and just sort of start painting this out. Again, this is done at different strengths, so if I want it to be darker and darker, I can just lift my mouse off and press down again and keep painting out. And that will bring all of this area that I painted out, painted in accidentally, and I'll take it out. So it'll leave the water sort of as it was there. You can sort of keep yourself in line by, oh, I didn't even go past here. Like this. Again, I'm pressing very lightly on the tablet to increase and decrease the brush size here. I don't have to be completely exact with this because this is a darker part of the image and it's not where the viewer is going to spend most of their time looking. The purpose of me including this dock was to use the natural leading lines in the railing to direct the viewer's eye around the scene. Brian, do you know if there's a way to toggle paint in or paint out?
Sure
easily?
is. Yeah, just use the X
Awesome.
key.
That's it?
Yep.
That's amazing. I didn't know that.
It's you wouldn't
It's all
actually
part of the
because
learning process.
well, it's a Photoshop shortcut that we kind of mirrored.
Okay. You're tricking me. All right. So the X key is going to save me a lot of going back and forth now. That's good. So I want to be painting in. I want to get rid of this mask that I've painted in here and go through this way. There are parts of the railing here that I don't want. Maybe a little bit there. Again, this is all going to be dark, and you can do this with varying degrees of opacity as well if you want. So I'm just looking at what I've got here. I might just be a little finer around the edge of this dot because I don't want to give it like a halo look, right? I want to make sure that it's actually looking as though it should. Okay. Whenever I'm editing, I always like to sort of, when I'm done with a piece or think I'm done with a piece, I'll take a step back and actually look at it and see, does it actually look right? Does it look like I want it to look? So at this point, here's my mask that I've created. There's a little sort of hot section here. I want to make sure that that's not actually doing anything bad. I don't think so. I might paint in a little stronger some of this part of the dock where there's some natural light falling on the dock and use that to bring out some of the color. You can see that there's a reflection from the light here. The dock was a little wet. So I'm just sort of dragging and painting across the dock. Okay, so what this has done is, if we look sort of from the top down, and again back to the analogies of the pieces of paper, you can see here, if I put the overlay on, everything that isn't red is on the top piece of paper. Everything that's red is, or a shade of red, is on the bottom piece of paper, giving us effectively, one look at an image, a cross section of something like that. Now I want to work on the sky, which is this part of the image. You can see by toggling the top layer, only the sky is changing in different parts of the dock that I didn't mask in. So by selecting this layer and going to Effects, I can edit what I've left unmasked in this image. And this will carry through to all of the effects that you see. So it's most obvious actually on these black and white images because this is color. You can see that the dock is still in color in all of these different previews from these different effects that are black and white. So the effect is only going to apply to the mask that I created. It's interesting coming to use this part of On1 because I hadn't had a chance to use this part of the suite prior to Suite 6. I was very excited up until its release, and it's been actually kind of fun to get used to it and figure it out. One of the challenges I have with it is figuring out exactly how to do what I want to do. And this is where I'm going to touch on like how to turn your ideas for a photo actually into something. What I want to do with the sky is to accentuate the sunrise. I want the pinks to be pinker, I want the yellows to come out. There are tinges of blue that I want to make pop a little bit more than what they are now. So just, I guess, color and tone. It's exactly what I want to change, right? So I'll look in here to sort of see what I can apply. And the good thing about Perfect Effects is it shows you what all the effects do in sort of a thumbnail way at the bottom. They've got different quirky names reflecting sort of what they do. Increased saturation might help me. You click on it and it will apply it to, you can see if I toggle it here, it's exactly the same sort of interface as back in layers. You can see that it's only applying the effect to what I masked out. What I masked in, sorry, from the Perfect Layers section of the program. I don't think this is going to give me exactly what I want. It's changing the color maybe a little too much. And what you can do here is this strength indicator. It always comes in at 100. You can drag it down, and you can see it gradually go back to 0. 0 is like the layer doesn't exist at all, or the effect doesn't exist at all. Somewhere about there might be useful. And the way, I mean, you can add other effects or stack this effect. If I wanted to make it more saturated, if 100 wasn't enough, I can go to Add to give me a new layer of effects and then hit Increase Saturation again if I wanted to. This is getting a little too colorful for my taste, so I'll bring it back down. Oops. So that is giving some nice red in the sky there, and some reflection on the water here and on the poles of the dock. So at this point, I'll leave this like this. I'll click Add, because if I don't click Add and I click on another effect, it will replace it with the currently selected layer. I want to make sure that any new effect that I apply is already going to go into this empty layer. And just because I'm a curious guy, I'll look around and see what other effects there are. Whether or not I want to apply it is a different story, depending on what it is. Like snow, for example, won't fit here. I want something to sort of make the yellows yellower, because this is just sort of white, and I want it to be more yellow. So glow, that sort of sounds like what I want, right? There's nothing sort of in here that's giving me yellow looks. Photo filters. warming. Let's see what that does. Aha! So these are getting yellow, and it's sort of muted the saturation effect a little bit. And this is entirely like the way I'm looking at this isn't in any way scientific. It's just me seriously going through saying photo filters. That sounds like something it might do. Oh, here it's 85 warming. That is what I want to do to my effect, to my photo. It's the effect I want. It says something to how I guess the software's been designed and laid out that it's intuitive enough to come through. So it's kind of cool that it makes it easy like that. It looks like there are different degrees of warming here. So again, if I click this without clicking add, it will replace the effect.
Hey, Jacob.
Yeah.
Do me a favor. I just want to jump in here really quickly for Emily.
Sure.
So for those of you out there who want to know the different ways of viewing all these thumbnails that you see along the bottom of Jacob's screen, Jacob, if you can hit the little 4 squares on the bottom right, yeah. So this is an alternate view. It's kind of our lightbox view to see all of the effects in a particular category. And then let's say Jacob doesn't want to work with the bar at all, that solid square will hide the bar altogether. And then the first square or the first icon will give you your default view back. Thanks for that, Jacob.
Yeah, sure. Are there any other questions I can answer?
Gordon asked a question a little bit back that I'm going to ask when you're done.
Okay, sure. All right, so again, I was looking for the yellow in this part of the sky here. There are different blending options you can choose. Like, I might not want this warming effect to apply to everything, and only to some of the saturation, some of the yellows in the image, right? There is, let's see, I think it's this inspector part here. This is still part of the tool that's somewhat new to me, where I think you can have the effect apply to only, here it is, blending options. You can set these different protect settings to apply, and this effect will only apply to the highlights here, midtones. This is not what I want to do, obviously. But this is, I think, effectively creating a mask for you for just the layer that you're applying. I'll leave that as all, and maybe I can look at these different blending modes here to figure out what I want to apply. Darken. The screen is to multiply, that's too much. Overlay. No, color. Maybe color. And then I don't want protect the shadows a little bit because I don't want to warm those up. You can see the blues if I adjust this. The blues are changing. I want to leave those a little darker and bring in the shadows, they're flesh colors. I'll leave that alone. But this is effectively doing the same thing that the opacity is doing here. So just for kicks, I'll hit apply there. And you can see the difference that this makes to the sky. It's sort of making it a little yellower. Okay, so at this point, if I'm done with the effects on the sky, I'll hit apply. And at this point, it comes back to the layers tab, which is like your home base for working within the suite. And it's coming here as Sky 1 as a new layer. So I can write Sky with effects, something better than Sky 1. And it's deselected the layer that I've imported below. You'll see that it's also got this mask here from when I imported it into effects. If I even want to turn this back on, I can. And it's going to bring back some of the dock. Because the effect applied to parts of the dock in this image, like it was applied to this in general, this mask is going to show the dock as affected. I kind of like that it's been brightened up, but I almost like to keep it darker because I want the image to be focusing on the sky and the city skyline. The dock is really just an aid for the viewer to subtly draw them through the frame. So I don't want to draw attention to it by making it brighter. So leaving it in a little bit of darkness is good. the only thing I want to do left to this image is to do some work on the dock itself. I think it could be a little bit maybe underexposed. So one thing that's cool about this section of Perfect Layers is this fill button, which I used a little bit before. And this can just fill the layer with essentially a color or some, I'm not actually sure what the other options are, warming, cooling, lighten, for example. I don't want to do any of those. I just want it to be white. And I'll hit OK. Blending mode. Multiply is fine, and then I can change the opacity that it comes in at. I'll set it to 100. And what this will do is, because all of this is, like, I can toggle this on and off, and you'll see the dock getting, it's only getting a little bit brighter. If I want that to be lighter again, I can either add another, I'm actually not sure how to do that. I know I can do it in Aperture with like a dodge tool or something like that, but I want to essentially draw a little bit more attention to the dock. I think that might actually be enough, because I don't want to, actually, I'll delete that and do it again. Fill. So let's try overlay at, wait, why is that not? Okay, there we go. And I can just bring this down a little bit to something like that, at a slightly less intense strength, to give some of the effect of the light shining on the dock there. I can even drag that down a little bit more. Okay, and at this point, we've got a couple of different masks, a fill layer at a certain degree of strength, and the dock. So I want to touch again on exactly how the layers and masks work, because without that, this image would have been the original image on each of them. It wouldn't have been possible. It would have looked either like that or, really underexposed like that. You wouldn't have seen anything that you saw like this, where the dock has come out, and it's really a key part of the image, in my opinion. So whatever's white on each layer or piece of paper is what remains. Whatever's black is removed, and whatever's a shade of black or a shade of gray is kind of removed. It's there, but at a lesser degree than what it otherwise would be if it were white. So somewhere in between, it's at a certain degree of opacity. That applies as you look top down through the pieces of paper. So this is the same mask, so it's in effect taking the same cut-out piece of paper and laying it on top of the other one. You'll still see straight through in these overlaid sections. We'll just highlight the mask here. So anything that's red here, you'll see through, which we'll see down onto this color fill layer. I'll just unselect these for now, which is just looking like this, brightening the parts of the image. So essentially all that we're seeing of the bottom layer is what is in the black and gray areas of the mask in the top layer. It's sort of what's been cut out to come through as a cross-section if we're looking top down through this stack of paper. So if I'm done with the image at this point, I'll just turn off the overlay and hit save. It does its thing. And this will save the image back into my Aperture library. I don't need to think about re-importing it or anything like that. So it's done saving. I hit close, and the image is here in Aperture. These are the two beginning images that I started with, and this is what I got out of Perfect Photo Suite. If for some reason I figured, oh, I meant to do something else to the dock, for example, I can very easily go edit with plugin, Perfect Photo Suite, bring it back in, and because it saved it as a PSD, you can see here, it's got all the different layers that I worked with there, as if I hadn't closed or saved out of the program. And at this point of the image, it's all about just, I guess, fine-tuning, and which I won't do at this point because it's not an Aperture webinar. But that's sort of how I would work with the suite, and how it's actually really intuitive to work with if you just think about what you want to do and go looking for it. The hardest part for me, the biggest hurdle, was essentially getting the hang of what a layer is, what a mask is, and a lot of it just came with practice and trial and error, figuring it out. The great thing about it is it's all non-destructive. So if I wanted to, decided I didn't like this effect over just the sky, I can unselect this layer and delete. Oops. Here we go. Non-destructive. Undo. Reset mask will clear the mask, and that will go straight through down to the dock. If I realize I did want that mask back, there's a way to copy and paste a mask from one layer to another. Copy mask from the source layer, go to where I want to paste it there, and it comes back. All of this is not changing anything I've done in Aperture, or any of my master images in Aperture. It's all stacked effects over what is the master image. Are there any questions at this point?
Excuse me. Well, the first question that I asked from earlier back was Gordon. He asked with the original images that you have, were any edits done to it beforehand in Aperture, or are these just kind of straight out of camera?
These are straight out of the camera. There's a way to toggle the master view in an image, and basically this is what the raw file looks like, and this is what let me go to one that I've edited. This is one I put on my site today from just further down the dock. This is the master image, and this is me editing it. If I do that same toggle over here, this is what it is. This is how it looks, straight out of camera. If you're asking about like how I got the effect in the sky with the blurry clouds, that's by virtue of a neutral density filter that was placed in front of the camera. Essentially, it's a black piece of glass that makes what the camera is seeing a lot darker, so you need to expose for longer to get a good exposure. The trick there is these clouds were moving with the wind, and because the camera was exposed for so long, in this case, let's see, a minute, just over a minute, it captures the motion in the sky.
Cool. And there's a question here. Peter asked a question. I can address it because you don't have Photoshop in here, but the question is, what happens if you open the PSD that you just created? If can you open that up in Photoshop? And the answer is absolutely yes, you can. It'll, just like Jacob showed when he brought it back into the suite, it retained the layers. If you were to send that PSD to Photoshop, the same exact layers with the titles and the masks would appear in your step. So it's the only thing that you can't do is if you're in Photoshop and you do something like add a text layer or a smart object or a smart layer, those are not recognized by the suite, and it'll ask you if you want to rasterize it, or in other words, if you want to flatten it. So
I wish I could answer that question for you. I can't.
That's but you know what? That's the reason why I'm really are you done with this, Jacob? With this
image, I can keep editing it in Aperture if you want to see what I would do here. I don't have anything else to sort of talk about for now. I know we're at 7 o'clock and this was supposed to be.
Oh no,
an hour or so.
It's beautiful.
I can go into another image if you want me to.
Nope. The only reason why I kind of wanted to talk to people about these things and to bring you in on the conversation. Well, first, actually, Gordon just asked what your feeling is about RAW.
RAW file format?
Yeah.
So I only shoot in RAW file format unless I'm doing something like a time lapse where I need to shoot JPEG to get a sheer volume of images on one card. The thing I like about RAW is, let's say that this was the only image that I came back with, right? If I wanted to sort of get to this image and then this image, because I'm shooting in RAW, it captures so much more data than a JPEG does, right? So I can create copies of this image inside of Aperture and bump up the exposure to get more of the dock, and I can play with the shadows here. Granted, it looks terrible like this, but there is enough information within the image to do this to a lesser extent. That's one reason I do it. The other reason is it does capture more information, which helps when you go into post-processing and editing and stuff like that.
Absolutely. Yeah, I agree with you 100% here, and also for for those of you who are really concerned about color, with RAW you have true white balance control, so whereas JPEG you really kind of forfeit that. At the risk of being presumptuous, there is no real need to shoot in JPEG these days. Cards are cheap enough now where you can kind of get an 8 gig card and shoot hundreds and hundreds of RAW files depending on the card. And there's a question about working in 16-bit versus 8-bit color depth. So I don't know if you have an opinion there.
So I don't know how much you guys know about what that exactly means. It's essentially the amount of information that you're seeing inside your image. 8 bits is, if you know about bits and bytes, if you're a programmer or have a computer science background, 8 bits and 16 bits, they sort of work logarithmically in that you get, to the power 2 more information in a 16-bit versus an 8-bit. It's just more information that you can work with in the image. Aperture sort of removes the need to know about that a little bit. I know in Photoshop there are editing ways where you can edit an image in, I think it's more with TIFFs and JPEGs as opposed to RAW files themselves. But you can edit in an 8-bit mode versus a 16-bit mode. It's sort of like a RAW and JPEG comparison, I think. And correct me if I'm wrong, Brian, but that's at least my understanding.
I agree 100% with that. You nailed it on the head. It's just a matter of, again, I work in 16-bit because it's just more color value information. Now, it's almost irrelevant. Not irrelevant, but like a color to me is not as relevant. But knowing that it's there is important.
If you do want to edit in Photoshop from here, there is a way to set your external editor. And you get, here you go. TIFFs and PSDs have the option to export from Aperture. This is just going to the Preferences tab in the menu here, export, and then you get to choose the file format.
Yep.
Bringing in a certain amount of information or not. It's for your purpose to decide.